Welcome to our talk on mental models, expectations, and implications of client-side scanning that we derived from an interview study with experts. I am Carolyn, and together with Divyanshu, I will guide you through this presentation. A short content warning before we continue. This talk will include mention of child sexual abuse and child sexual abuse material. 32,059,029. That is the number of reports the cyber tip line of the US National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, short NCMEC, received in 2022. More than 99.5% of these reports were classified as child sexual abuse material, also known as CSAM. One way these reports are generated are through so-called server-side scanning. Here, a person A sends a message via a server to a person B. While that message is in transit over the server, it is scanned on the server for targeted content, for example, CSAM. In recent years, there has been a move towards end-to-end encryption for communication channels, which means that a message would pass over the server encrypted. This means that server-side scanning is not feasible anymore. One idea people had to solve this was client-side scanning. On a very high level, client-side scanning means scanning an end-user device, a client device for targeted material. Apple proposed the introduction of client-side scanning, or short CSS, into its ecosystem in 2021. However, Apple received a lot of backlash and scrapped the project at the end of 2022. There have also been mention of client-side scanning in legislative proposals or complementary assessments from the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. However, we could not find a comprehensive definition of client-side scanning that was the same for all. This leaves the question, what is client-side scanning? We wanted to answer this by focusing on experts, since client-side scanning is discussed on a very high level, as CSS to fight CSAM didn't exist when we started this project. We came up with 3 research questions that we wanted to answer in cooperation with experts who are stakeholders in the discussion surrounding CSS. Research question 1 covers experts' mental models of client-side scanning. Research question 2 covers experts' expectations of client-side scanning. And research question 3 covers the potential implications of client-side scanning. We collected complementary data with 28 participants through 25 semi-structured interviews. Our participants covered a range of different backgrounds. Some were from academia, both law and computer science. Some had a digital rights background, worked or volunteered in child protection, worked in law enforcement or data protection. Our questions in the semi-structured interviews covered topics such as technical understanding of client-side scanning, expectations, implications, and stakeholders. Our data analysis was split between the mental models on one hand and expectations and implications on the other. For both, we applied combinations of open, actual, and selective coding. Let's now move on to the results. Before diving into our first research question to look at mental models, I want to give you an overview of the interplay between mental models, expectations, and implications. In accordance with what we learned from our participants, we actually cannot start with mental models, but we have to start with a goal. This goal then leads to one or several mental models, which in turn lead to expectations and implications. Throughout our research, we found that our participants set the goal, the expectations and implications within a certain context. For this research, this is the CSAM, so child sexual abuse material context. However, the mental models our participants described were not dependent on this context. Thus, we have tried to decontextualize the mental models as much as possible. Let's now briefly look at the goal within the CSAM context. This goal, according to our participants, is to prevent the dissemination of CSAM via communication channels. Let's zoom back out to the big picture and leave the CSAM context behind to look at our mental models. The mental model I am about to present to you is an aggregated mental model based on our participants. Our participants did not have a one-dimensional mental model, but multidimensional mental models. I will go into detail on this point after describing the aggregated mental model. We will start with a client-side scanning system that encompasses a CSS algorithm. The CSS algorithm encompasses 4 non-negotiables, 2 central and 2 environmental components that are present for every CSS system. The 2 central components are the how and the what. The how gives the actual type of algorithm used for scanning. That means whether a hashing algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, or something else is used. The what gives the content type. That means whether an image, a video, a text, or even a behavior is scanned. The 2 environmental components are the where and the when. The where describes whether the scanning happens on the application layer, the operating system layer, or the device layer. The when describes whether the scanning happens at any time or based on a certain action, for example, sending or receiving a message. Furthermore, the CSS algorithm has an input and an output. The input is the actual content to be scanned and some comparison data the content is compared to. The output answers whether the content matches this comparison data or not, which includes false positives and false negatives. This described the CSS algorithm and its inner workings. However, the CSS system does not exist in a vacuum, but interacts with its environment. There are always outside requirements present that can be of a technical, process-related, policy-dependent, or legal nature. However, they're all context-dependent, which is why I will not go into more detail. The CSS system also interacts with a scanning data handling entity that sets the goal of what should be scanned for. This is in turn dependent on the context and the content topic, and gives the content type. The CSS system also interacts with a user. Several factors come into play with the user. First, whether the user benefits from the system. Second, whether the user has given consent and is participating voluntarily, or whether use is mandatory. Third, whether the usage of a CSS system is disclosed to the user, and whether the user is notified in case of a match. Fourth, what the legal framework in the country or region of application is. Fifth, whether an application is targeted to a small group of people, or whether it is applied to the general population. And sixth, whether the application sends something to a third party. This leads us to the last part of a CSS system, which is present if a report is sent to a third party or even a different device component, the report handling entity. If a report handling entity is present, usually a threshold needs to be passed before a report is sent. This concludes the high-level description of the aggregated mental model. Our participants did not have one-dimensional mental models, but multidimensional mental models. Thus, we have derived dimensions of CSS. The first level of this graph gives categories similar to the ones I just described. The second level are the dimensions of CSS. And the third and any further levels give different options for each dimension available. So far, we have looked at the goals and mental models. We will now reapply the CSAM context and look at expectations and implications, for which I hand over to Divyanshu.
So, in terms of expectations of client-side scanning in the CSAM context, we first looked at adoption and reception. Participants expected some form of CSS adoption. This was based on a lack of alternatives making CSS attractive, as taking any action rather than doing nothing can be appealing. While most participants strongly objected to adoption, some saw CSS as a viable band-aid measure. Next, we looked at implementation expectations, where participants used real-world analogies like sending a post to describe CSS. Their expectations regarding the implementation of the CSS system were closely tied to their mental models. For use, participants expected CSS to block dissemination of CSAM, safeguard victims, identify and potentially prosecute bad actors. However, they acknowledged that it could be misused as it is not linked to any particular domain. Finally, participants expected technical and logistical challenges with the deployment of CSS. So what are these expected challenges? First, differentiating CSAM from non-CSAM content. Accurately distinguishing between CSAM and non-CSAM content is difficult but vital. Participants brought up a real-world example where an individual lost their account by sharing a medical image of their child to the doctor. Next, integrity of the CSS system, which includes reliability of the algorithm and database, its technical robustness, and ease of scalability. Lastly, an overwhelmed legal system. Participants expected that the volume of reports compounded by large number of people could render legal systems dysfunctional. Now, let's move on to implications. Participants' expectations influenced the potential implications they saw from a CSS system. Personal implications would be potential privacy breaches, loss of account, confusion, fear, and reputational harm. This could lead to a negative perception in society, which could force people to withdraw from digital spaces. Societal implications would be more overarching effects. People feeling constantly surveilled upon, society having to self-edit and self-censor would hinder free social communication. And of course, there would be implications of threats. Such a system could be used to target individuals or groups that hold differing opinions, wrongfully shutting down accounts by spamming them CSAM, and even expand the search domain. I will briefly also talk about implications on two specific stakeholder groups. First, children and teenagers. As part of youth culture, children and teenagers often exchange intimate images with consent. Criminalizing this behavior could be detrimental to their growth. Children with difficult family relationships or communicational barriers like LGBTQ children would be even more vulnerable. Also, companies and service providers implementing and maintaining a CSS system would be pressured to have an extra safe system or risk extreme backlash. Furthermore, they would have to determine their compliance with the laws and policies of a region while considering their moral and ethical responsibilities. As for discussion points, a few things really resonated with us. Number one, from all these interviews, we believe that CSS will harm children. Number two, CSS is on a very slippery slope of being a technology that works against its users, which is never a good idea. Number three, less invasive approaches like Apple's sensitive content warning feature are definitely steps in the right direction. Finally, we would like to reiterate that CSAM and its dissemination is a complex societal problem which cannot simply be solved by technology. With that, I would like to thank you for listening to our talk. If you want to learn more, please read our paper and get in touch afterwards or come find us at CHI.